Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and welcome to the third and final installment of thermally testing the MSI Z690 Torpedo EKX motherboard plus monoblock bundle, and now we're finally testing the thermal performance of the monoblock. And I gotta say, I'm slightly disappointed. Yeah. The ambient air temperature right now is 19 degrees Celsius and has been for basically the last hour that the system has been running Prime 95. It's running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX2, still using the same 12600 KF that I used in the video with the Supremacy block, because otherwise it wouldn't be a valid comparison. The loop's the same. We will go over, actually, will we? Yeah, we'll go over what's in the system in this video, so I'm not sure why I'm worried about that. But I had to turn down the overclock a little bit, as in I've only turned down the frequency. I've not touched the voltage, because slightly lowering the operating frequency, that doesn't really affect power consumption, but changing the voltage has very quickly leads to drastic changes in power consumption, because the effect of core voltage on power consumption is quadratic. So for a 10% increase in voltage, you get a 21% increase in power consumption, which means if you turn down the voltage a little bit, it actually makes a really big drop in, like a much larger drop in terms of power draw. Anyway, so I had to turn down the frequency, and the reason I had to turn down the frequency a little bit is because since the monoblock is running like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius hotter than the Supremacy block was, the CPU, so for the Supremacy block, I ran over 2 hours of Prime 95. With the monoblock, the issue here is that somewhere between like 30 minutes and 3 hours into a Prime 95 run, this has a tendency to blue screen if I use the same settings that I used with the Supremacy block because of the higher CPU temperatures. So, yeah, if you wanted proof that 12th gen is temperature sensitive, then there's that. Which, like, 20 megahertz is not a big deal. That's like, you're not going to notice a 20 megahertz frequency difference in terms of, like, performance and day-to-day usage. But I am still slightly disappointed by the fact that, like, you know, we're giving up CPU cooling here. Especially since, like, from what I was told about the monoblock, it uses a newer cold plate design, so I figured it would have better cooling performance than the Supremacy block, and then it ends up being 4 to 5 degrees Celsius worse, and it's just like, well, yeah, that's not better. So that's kind of that. Anyway, so the CPU cooling performance is I mean, we do have to keep in mind that this is with the CPU pulling like over 270 watts. So this isn't a like cooling performance difference that you would notice in day-to-day usage. Unless your day-to-day usage is like 3D rendering or video encoding or, you know, like constant 100% CPU load type workloads. If you're just gaming, then actually this will give you basically the same temperatures as the Supremacy block, because I would be surprised if a 12600 KF, even with a heavy overclocked, pulled, you know, more than like... I'll be generous and say more than 150 watts. And at 150 watts power consumption instead of the 270 that we're pushing here, the temperature difference between the Supremacy block and this monoblock theoretically should shrink from, you know, 4 to 5 degrees to like 2 degrees Celsius. So, yeah, I don't think that would be... I think most people who are interested in buying a monoblock because they think a monoblock looks good wouldn't care about this temperature difference. The thing is, personally, the only reason I've ever been interested in custom water cooling loops is because they offer more cooling, more cooling than anything else, with the exception of going like, well, no, because the thing is, once you get to like chillers, those still require a custom water cooling loop, right? Like you still need a CPU block, you still need a pump. You're just replacing the radiator part of the loop. So that's kind of the thing. So since I've only ever been interested in custom loops for maximum cooling performance, to me this isn't really what I was hoping for when I agreed to test this. Yeah. Anyway, now the VRM temperatures, on the other hand, those are excellent, because of course they are. We're water cooling the VRM, which and admit, like, we're water cooling the VRM through a steel plate, a thermal pad, an aluminum heatsink, and another thermal pad. But the thing is, VRMs really don't produce a lot of heat. And so even with all those different layers of thermal interface material, yeah, the VRM ends up sitting at under 50 degrees Celsius, after an hour and 15 minutes of Prime 95. So this sort of like really cost optimized approach to monoblock design, it works great for cooling the VRM. In fact, it works so well for cooling the VRM that I kind of wonder if there would have been some way that EK could have skewed the performance of the block to like more towards cooling the CPU and less towards cooling the VRM. I don't think that the heat from the VRM is causing the temperature difference that we're seeing between the supremacy block and the monoblock, because the VRM is probably putting out a tenth of the heat output of the CPU. Um, you know, and that's honestly that wouldn't even really be great efficiency. Like that wouldn't really be that great at VRM efficiency. But let's say if the CPU, like if the VRM is putting out a tenth of the heat of the CPU, not all of that heat is going to end up going into the monoblock anyway. So yeah, I like if the temperature was like a degree higher, I'd say okay, that might actually be the heat from the VRM getting added to the cooling loop. But 4 to 5 degrees, that I think is like maybe it's a flow restriction thing, maybe the cold plate's just worse. I'm really not sure on that part. It's not like I really have any way to isolate it from the rest of the monoblock. So yeah. Anyway, so I'm a bit disappointed by the CPU cooling performance here, but the VRM is ice cold. Like 49 degrees Celsius for VRM components that's a great temperature. That really, yeah, like there's nothing to complain about there. Um, and so that's kind of it for the actual like thermal performance of this setup. Is like if your priority is maximum CPU cooling, this is not it. But if you want a monoblock, which still does like it's still doing a perfectly good job of cooling the CPU. It's just not doing the best job of cooling the CPU. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. Because the thing is, I'm not going to comment on the aesthetics of monoblocks because, like I said, and it's not like when I when I look at custom loops that are very like good looking, I go like, yes, that's good looking, and then I never like it's not a thing that I consider when building a loop myself. Like I can appreciate when or yeah, I can kind of appreciate when somebody else builds a system that looks good, but personally couldn't care less. My priorities with any custom loop I've ever built is like how easy is it going to be to swap the motherboard without taking the loop apart? How easy is it going to be to swap the CPU without taking the loop apart? Where do I think like and that's basically it. Like actually, yeah. I've never really considered it. Well, also, how do I get the largest possible radiator wherever there's enough space? That's kind of my thought process for building custom loops. Aesthetics are just kind of like, whatever. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's the cooling performance side of this. Like it's fine. It's just not the best. Yeah, because anyway, and well, for the VRM, I guess it's your VRM cooling, well, you could probably get more VRM cooling than this, but there's absolutely no point. Like at 49 degrees Celsius, the VRM really doesn't need any more cooling. And for comparison, so if you run the motherboard completely passive with no airflow, the VRM will easily end up like at 80 degrees Celsius or even higher potentially. And if you're running the motherboard in a case with decent case airflow, then the VRM tends to sit around sort of 67 to like 70 degrees Celsius. So the thing is, the monoblock actually potentially could make a lot of sense if you had some kind of super low airflow system in a high ambient temperature. Because the thing is, like 80 degrees Celsius also really isn't anything to worry about on VRM components. But I'm thinking, like, let's say you had like a 40 degrees Celsius ambient, which I don't know how you could live in that, but I don't know, maybe you're using the motherboard for like a data center or something, or like a server setup or something, in which case maybe the ambient's horrible. Um, so, and you don't have a lot of airflow because you want it to be quiet, then in that scenario, the monoblock just does such, like, it really does do a great job of cooling the VRM. Um, but yeah, I wish the CPU cooling was better. Anyway, let's move on to some other. Well, let's take a look at the system, and then also I have one other complaint for the monoblock, and that one's actually sort of more significant to me than the CPU temperatures, because this, like I was hoping it would be better, but it's okay, I guess. Anyway, let's move on to what the system looks like. So these are the setups. So this is with the supremacy block, and this is with the monoblock. As you can see, I have never heard of such a thing as aesthetics, because that right there is a rainbow 24 pin. I'm not even trying to hide it. Also, the 8 pin is just kind of awkwardly running up around the pump. And actually, that is like a very regular occurrence in my personal builds. Like when I've built computers in cases, the 8 pin almost always ends up running through that area because I don't know what it is, but most power supplies I've had don't reach the 8-pin power connector in an ATX case. Like, and admittedly, this PSU, I have it in a weird orientation, but even if I flip this PSU, that 8-pin is not going to reach. So, anyway, yeah, and then my tubing length is optimized for being able to remove the motherboard without taking the loop apart. So obviously the tubing is a bit on the, like, it's longer than it has to be, and I guess it kind of looks messy, but anyway, so that's the monoblock setup, and it really, well, the only difference between the CPU block and the monoblock setup is that the outlet tube for the water block is short. So the CPU block had a shorter outlet tube to the radiator than the monoblock does, because the monoblock moves the port, like inlet and outlet ports, towards the rear I/O, and so the tube that I had over here, which was actually sort of a reasonable length, yeah, it didn't reach anymore. So now the tube is way longer because I didn't want to deal with having to, like, I didn't want to worry about if I got it the right length, so it just made it way too long. Anyway, the case I'm using is a Corsair Carbide 400. I think it's a Carbide? Yeah, Corsair Carbide 400C. So it has the blocked off front panel, and I did test it with the front dust filter. Like, I'm using the case like a case. Like, I'm not doing this because I didn't want to do a test of this on an open air test bench, because it's a monoblock motherboard. I would assume most people using this are probably putting it in a case. Anyway, and then the loop that I'm using is the EK Classic Kit P360. So with the monoblock, I've literally just swapped out the supremacy block that this comes with the monoblock, and that's the only difference there. So that's the test setup. Now for my bigger, more concerning complaint, the thermal pads. So you'll notice that the thermal pad over here is pink, not blue, because the EK thermal, like the thermal pads this comes with, are 2 millimeters thick. And I think we can all very clearly see how that's a problem. Like, half the CPU isn't making contact with the block, right? Like, I'm just going to put this over here. For comparison, this is what the thermal paste spread looks like if you don't use any thermal pads at all. So what I ended up having to do in order to, like, if I use the stock 2 millimeter pads, the CPU just immediately hits the 107 degrees Celsius thermal throttle. And so we go from the VR, like, it basically goes from the CPU temperatures are slightly worse than the supremacy block to the CPU temperatures are absolutely atrocious. And, like, ultimately, I didn't bother to test what kind of overclock it would sustain, because with this kind of thermal paste spread, like, this is the kind of thing where, like, you just don't run it like this. Like, this is just not okay at all as far as I'm concerned. Like, testing it in this configuration would have been an absolute like no, I'm not testing it like that. Like this is totally unacceptable as far as I'm concerned for uh like to be happening with the stock 2 millimeter pads. Incidentally, even without any thermal pads at all, the CPU temperatures still end up being like 4 to 5 degrees Celsius higher than with the Supremacy block. So it really isn't the VRM heat, like the heat from the VRM adding to the CPU's operating temperature. It's just the monoblock is not that good at cooling the CPU, even in sort of the best case scenario for it, where, you know, it's not actually cooling the VRM, it's only cooling the CPU, there's no thermal pads, so, you know, it's getting as much like the mount, like it's not really going to get a better mounting configuration. Um, and yeah, and so the thing is, like, this is in my opinion, this is a relatively easy fix. The monoblock should just come with two different thicknesses of thermal pads. Because the thing is, like, this is super obvious if you install the monoblock even once without filling the loop. Or like before you fill the loop, right? Before you finish building the whole loop, you just install the block with the 2 millimeter pads. If your thermal paste looks like this, then where you can very clearly see that it's not making proper contact on like half the CPU, you switch over to 1.5 millimeter thermal pads. Um, and that would basically fix that as far as I'm concerned, because the 2 millimeter, and I'm not sure how much too thick, like how much thicker than they are than necessary. It's possible that my motherboard has just like freakishly tall VRM heat sinks, and that's why, you know, I'm having issues with the 2 millimeter pads. But even then, I still think there would be no harm in just including 1.5 millimeter pads anyway, because this really is trivial to check if, like, you know, if your heat sinks, oops. Um, well, wait, how did I do that? Oh no. Oh, I started scrolling through the photo collection. That's what I did. Anyway, well, I guess we can just flick through to that. Yeah. So, yeah, that's my main complaint. Is just the 2 millimeter pads is just they lift like they lift the side of the CPU of the monoblock that's nearest to the VRM, and then the CPU cooling is absolutely horrendous. Like it's no longer, oh, it's slightly worse. It's just horrible. So yeah, if EK just adds 1.5 millimeter pads to the board, then because you can just check if the thermal paste spread is good. If it is, you use the 2 millimeter pads. If it isn't, you switch to the 1.5s, and then it's fine. They could have also used thermal putty, but I suggested that, and like was told by somebody that it makes a horrible mess, which is true, but you also don't have to worry about it being too thin or too thick because it'll fill. If I'm not mistaken, most thermal putties will fill any gap that's between 0.5 and 5 millimeters. So you really don't have to worry about being accurate with your measurements with that stuff. Um, so, yeah, anyway, that's the, I guess, conclusion for my testing here. The monoblock is just kind of worse than the supremacy block at cooling the CPU. If you're buying this, I would suggest that you get your own 1.5 millimeter thermal pads to go along with it, just in case you end up with a board where the VRM heat sinks are like freakishly tall or something. I didn't take my board apart, by the way. I've not taken the motherboard apart at all. Um, Also, I did crank down the monoblock as much as I could. In fact, the other like with the 1.5 millimeter pads, I don't think I have the block as cranked down as I had it with the 2 millimeter pads. Then again, the 2 millimeter pads were lifting the block up, so that might have actually made the mounting hardware feel a lot stiffer than it, like, in terms of, like, you wouldn't have to screw the block down as far to get the same level of like resistance from the springs because the block would have been sitting higher than it should have been. But yeah, so there. It's a monoblock. I'm kind of feeling like I'm being overly negative with this, but the thing is, like, to me, the aesthetics part of this is just kind of like, whatever. So it's super hard for me to judge this. I feel like I'm like the wrong person to be evaluating the, you know, like value of a monoblock like this, because as far like my priority, because the thing is, yeah, it cools the VR. Like the thing is, going from 67 degrees Celsius on the VRM to 50, or even from 80 degrees Celsius on the VRM to 50, doesn't let you run higher overclocks if your CPU temperatures go up by 4 degrees, right? So to me, it's kind of like, but but CPU, like we need to cool the CPU first, then we can worry. Like this isn't one of those motherboards where the VRM isn't able to, like, yeah, like this just isn't one of those boards where the VRM sucks so much that it actually needs water cooling. Um, so at that point, it's just kind of like, yeah, this is primarily an aesthetics thing, and I can't judge that because I don't care. So yeah, um, there. That's my evaluation of the monoblock. Now hopefully I wasn't overly negative with this. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. Both Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it would be much appreciated if you check them out. And that's it for the video, so thank you for watching, and goodbye.